This is the second part of a video series on randomization in studies. In the first video, I described what randomization is. If you haven't seen that, please watch that first. And in this video, I will describe how randomization solves the problem that we addressed in the previous video. I'll start out with a quick recap of what we talked about in the first video. So in the last video, we talked about how the fundamental problem with determining whether a particular intervention or drug or whatever is having an impact or the desired impact on the outcome is that in real life, the person only ever experiences one of those things. They either participate in the program or intervention or take the drug, or they do not. And so we can only see the path forward after that initial decision there. And so when we try to compare those who took a drug versus those who didn't, or those who engaged in a professional development versus those who didn't, there are a lot of problems. And the fundamental problem that we have to deal with is that we don't know why the individuals came to participate in the intervention or take the drug. So this person could have taken this, participate in this professional development because that's the kind of person they are. They're really motivated. Maybe they're the kind of person that makes a lot of phone calls for, a lot of sales calls. Maybe they get up early so that they can start their day and do a lot of other practices that help them with their sales. And maybe they have more supportive managers. And so when we compare those that participate in a professional development for improving sales, we look at their sales relative to those salespeople who do not participate in that program, that professional development. The difference there might be due to other factors that have nothing to do with the professional development. And maybe these other factors are related to the person's likelihood of participating in professional development, and they're related to the likelihood that they have higher sales scores. And this is a fundamental challenge when this process of participating in a professional development or an intervention or taking a drug, when that process is not random. So let's look at this group that ends up taking this professional development and then another group that ends up not. And this is just casually happening as a function of a whole host of other reasons. Nobody's controlling who's taking the professional development versus who's not. So what randomization does is that it makes this process that dictates how people end up in the professional development versus not ending up in the professional development. It makes that process random. So it's analogous to flipping a coin. So this person, you flip a coin, heads, they go into professional development, tails, they don't. This person, you flip a coin, heads, they go into professional development, tails, they don't. And what that tends to do is that it tends to balance out the people who went into the professional development relative to those people who did not go into professional development on a whole host of factors. So whereas before, when you just sort of let people naturally go into professional development or not on the basis of whatever factors that are going on in the world or in their minds or in their background, instead, because it's a random process, you tend to get an even distribution of people who, in terms of the number of phone calls they make, between those who got the professional development and those who did not. You also will get an even distribution in terms of how early they get up in the morning, as well as the supportive nature of the managers. That characteristic will be distributed evenly between the two groups. Another important piece is that when you randomize, you also have this balancing taking place for a whole host of other factors that you never even thought to measure. This is really important because sometimes when people don't use random assignment and, but they think to control for other factors using statistics. And when you use random assignment, it balances out for those things too. So it's a really robust way to control for a whole bunch of things at the same time, many things that you thought about and many things that you didn't think about. So I'm going to illustrate how randomization works by using R. And just to give you a heads up, I have created a data set with a person's ID, and then We have a column called manager support score from 0 to 10. The higher the number, the more support they get from their manager. A variable called gets up early. And we also have another variable called average number of calls per day. And then we have, there's going to be two scenarios. One scenario, whether they were in the professional development, relies on or depends on these factors. And then we'll do another version of professional development where it's going to be the result of a random process. So like flipping a coin to put each person in the professional development versus not putting them in the professional development. So here we are in R. I'm going to start out by reading in a data file, and we're going to take a look at it real quick. So this data file that I created has 100 rows, so one row for each salesperson, and then it has 6 columns. The first column is the ID of that person. The second column is the manager support score. It goes from 0 to 10. The next one is whether they get up early, and if they have a 0, they don't get up early, and if they have a score of 1, then they do get up early. And then there's a variable called average number of calls per day, which reflects just that. And then there's a column here called non-random professional development program. And this column I made to depend on these other factors. So those people that have higher manager support score, they tend to get up early, they tend to make more calls per day, also have a slightly higher likelihood of participating in this professional development program. And then I have a different column called random professional development program, and this reflects whether that person is in the professional development program, but the way they received a 0 or 1 in this case was completely random. So it doesn't depend on any factors. Everybody has the same likelihood of being in there. It's sort of like a coin flip. So we're going to start out by just looking at some summary statistics here. So as I said before, the manager support score goes from 0 to 10. Whether they get up early is either a 0 or a 1 for no or yes respectively. Then average number of calls per day ranges from a low of 35 average calls per day to a high of about 59.7 here. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clean up the data, just create some variables that make it clearer. And so instead of 1s and 0s, I'll make it either professional development to indicate that they're in the professional development group, or a 0 to indicate they're in the comparison group, that sort of thing. And then I'm going to summarize the data because we're going to visualize these differences here. So in this grouping here, we have this variable is average manager support, which again varied from 0 to 10. And what we find is that those that were in the professional development group tended to have a slightly higher average manager support score. So if we find differences in sales, this could be partly the reason why we found that difference. They just had more supportive managers. Now in contrast, when I randomly assign them to professional development, this is what we see. It's much more close together. So the professional development group has an average manager support score of 4.9, and then the comparison group has an average score of 5. And that's nice because then you eliminate this as a possibility for why you could see differences in scores in sales numbers. This next graph shows the proportion of people who get up early in the two groups. And now for this one, it's the non-random assignment process here. And so what we see here is that about 0.49 or about 49% of those who are in this professional development group get up early, compared to about 38% in the comparison group that get up early. Now, in contrast, when I randomly assign everybody into either professional development or the comparison group, we see that the professional development group, 48% of them get up early, and then in the comparison group, about 44%. So again, they're much closer together here, eliminating this as a potential contributing factor for why you could see differences in the sales numbers. And then this last comparison is on the average number of calls. So we see here when you don't have a random process for dictating who receives the professional development, and those in the professional development group here make 49.4 calls on average per day, compared to those in the comparison group who have an average of 41.9. And again, sales is not my area of expertise, but I imagine the more calls you make for sales, the more sales you're going to get. And so it could be because those in the professional development just make more phone calls than those that are not in there. Now, by randomly assigning, again here on the right, this is what happens when you randomly assign. When you randomly assign people into either the professional development or the comparison group, we see that that difference diminishes greatly. Now, so far I've been talking about, average calls, proportion who get up early, average manager support. But again, like I said before, there could be a whole host of reasons why people tend to go into the professional development program if sort of left to their own devices. And many of those you will not be capturing, and they just fly under your radar. And so what random assignment does is it helps to balance out on those other factors that you're not even considering. And so this is why random assignment is such a powerful tool in studies, and they're used in drug studies and a whole host of other studies, where it's extremely important that they find out whether a program or a drug has the desired effect on the outcomes. And so when you randomly assign people into an intervention or a drug versus a comparison group, then you know that they're equal on everything else except for the fact that they were either in the program or not in the program. So that leaves that one difference. And so when you see a difference in the outcome, then you can attribute it to whether they participated in the program or took the drug versus not. I hope this video is interesting. If you want to see more, please subscribe.